The winter of 1873 came down on the Dakota Plains like a hammer. It was not a gentle slide into dormancy, a soft blanket of snow over a sleeping land. It was a declaration of war. The cold did not knock before it entered. It kicked down the door. It was a physical presence, an invisible predator that hunted the warmth in every log cabin, in every living body. The wind was its voice, a ceaseless moan that scraped across the frozen landscape, carrying with it ice crystals as sharp as ground glass. For the settlers in the small, hopeful community of Providence Creek, survival was measured in cords of wood and the integrity of mud chinking between logs. In those first brutal weeks of the season, every cabin told the same story. A fire roared in the stone hearth, a frantic, hungry beast that devoured oak and ash with an insatiable appetite. Yet, 10 feet from its heat, the air was a knife. Water froze in buckets left by the door. Breath plumed in the air of the single room where families huddled together. Frost didn't just paint the window panes. It grew like a crystalline fungus on the interior walls, tracing the lines of the logs where the cold had breached their defenses. The chimney, the very symbol of a warm hearth, was a traitor. It was a gaping wound in the roof, siphoning the precious heat out into the unforgiving sky as fast as the fire could produce it. The men would spend their days in a desperate cycle of chopping and hauling, their axes ringing against frozen wood with a dull, defeated thud. The women spent their days feeding the fire, plugging drafts with rags, and watching their children, whose faces were pale and whose coughs were dry and sharp in the frigid air. They were doing everything right, everything they had been taught. They built their cabins sturdy, with thick logs and stone fireplaces, just as their fathers had done back east. They laid in stores, they worked hard, and they prayed. But the Dakota winter did not care about tradition. It was a new and more powerful enemy, and their old weapons were failing. The community struggled as one. The family of John Miller lost 2 of their cattle in a single night, frozen solid in their lean-to. The young wife of the blacksmith, a woman who had arrived just that summer with dreams of a new life, fell ill with a fever that the cold would not allow to break. The settlement's elder, a man named Marcus Thorne, who had built more cabins than anyone, would walk from dwelling to dwelling, his face grim. He would inspect the chinking, advise on how to stack the wood, how to bank the fire. He gave the same advice he had always given, the advice that had always worked before. But it was not working now. The cold was winning, and a quiet, gnawing fear began to settle over the community, a fear colder than any frost. They were all in the same leaky boat, bailing against the same relentless storm. Into this shared struggle stepped Ilara. She was a widow, a quiet woman who had arrived 2 years prior with her husband, an engineer who dreamed of building bridges in the new territory. But a sudden illness had taken him the first spring, leaving Ilara with a small son named Thomas and a collection of strange books filled with diagrams and figures. She was seen as an outsider, a woman of books and quiet observation in a world that valued loud strength and practical, calloused hands. She was polite but distant, and the community treated her with a kind of gentle pity. They saw her as a delicate thing, ill-suited for the harsh realities of the prairie, a woman who would surely fail without a man to guide her. That autumn, as the other families were rechinking their logs and stacking their woodpiles high, Ilara did something that baffled them all. She sold her husband's heavy logging axe and his best saw. With the money, she bought 2 sturdy shovels, a wheelbarrow, and a wagon load of bricks and clay pipe from a trader passing through. Then she walked to the south-facing slope of a low hill just west of the settlement, a place no one would ever think to build, and began to draw a shape in the dirt. It was not the familiar square of a cabin. It was a long rectangle, oriented to the sun. Her plan, when she explained it to Marcus Thorne, who had come to see what foolishness she was up to, was met with stunned silence, followed by a slow, pitying shake of his head. She was not going to build up, she explained. She was going to build in. She intended to dig her home directly into the hillside, using the earth itself as her primary wall. It would be a dugout, a burrow. But the strangest part of her plan was the hearth. She described a massive brick stove that would sit in the center of the room, not against a wall. It would have no chimney, she said, not one that went through the roof. Marcus stared at her as if she had lost her mind. No chimney? He finally managed, his voice a low rumble of disbelief. Woman, are you trying to kill yourself and that boy? You'll fill the place with smoke in an hour. You'll suffocate in your sleep. He was the most experienced builder in the territory, a man whose word on logs and stone was law. He saw her idea not just as foolish, but as a dangerous fantasy born from grief and strange books. The community's reaction followed Marcus's lead. At first, it was concerned advice. Then, as Ilara ignored them and began to dig, it turned to mockery. Men would stop by on their way to the woods, leaning on their axes and watching her toil. "Building a gopher hole, Ilara," one called out, and the others laughed. The women whispered among themselves at the general store. "The poor thing," they'd say. "Her husband's death has unsettled her mind." Her project became a local joke. She was the digging widow, the woman who thought she could live like a badger and breathe smoke like a dragon. The laughter followed her, a constant, stinging reminder of her isolation. But Ilara did not stop. She simply pulled the brim of her bonnet lower and sank her shovel into the earth again. She was not building from pride or theory. She was building from a deep, calculated certainty, a knowledge her husband had left her, and a desperate love for the small boy who watched her from the shade of the wagon. So began the long, solitary work. While the sounds of axes and hammers echoed from the settlement, creating the familiar shapes of cabins rising against the sky, Ilara's labor was quiet, deep, and largely invisible. Her days fell into a rhythm of relentless physical effort. The shovel became an extension of her arms. She drove it into the dense prairie soil, a mixture of thick sod and clay that fought back with every spadeful. She learned the language of the earth, where the stones were hidden, where the soil was softest after a rain. Each load in the wheelbarrow was a small victory, trundled away to be used later for the roof. She was not just digging a hole, she was sculpting a space, carefully carving out the dimensions she had memorized from her husband's diagrams. The work was isolating. The men who had once offered pitying advice now just shook their heads and moved on, too busy with their own winter preparations to waste more words on her. The women stopped visiting, uncomfortable with her silent, dirt-caked determination. Only her son, Thomas, was her constant companion. He would play near the growing mound of earth, a small, steadfast presence that fueled her resolve. When her back ached and her hands bled, she would look at his face, at the trusting innocence in his eyes, and she would pick up the shovel again. She was not just building a shelter, she was building a fortress to protect him from the coming hammer of winter. While the community raised walls of wood, Ilara lined her earthen walls with stone, a painstaking process of fitting and mortaring that created a solid, damp-proof barrier. Then came the most critical part of her design, the heater. It was not a fireplace, a simple box for burning wood. It was a complex, massive structure of brick and mortar that rose in the center of the dugout. Inside it, she constructed a serpentine path for the smoke and hot gases, a long, winding maze of channels designed to force the heat to surrender itself to the brick mass before it could escape. It was slow, precise work. Every brick had to be level, every mortar joint perfect. The men in the village could raise a whole wall in the time it took her to lay a single course of bricks. They saw her slowness as incompetence. She knew it was a requirement for efficiency. The community finished their preparations long before she did. Marcus Thorne's cabin, like the others, stood tall and proud, its chimney straight and true, a plume of smoke already rising from it on the cooler autumn mornings. They had stacked their firewood, patched their roofs, and settled in, casting glances toward the scarred hillside where the widow was still toiling. They saw her wrestling with long sections of clay pipe, fitting them together into a long tube that she laid in a shallow trench running from the back of her brick stove, away from the dugout, and out toward the lower part of the slope. This was her chimney, her solution to the smoke. It ran horizontally, underground, for nearly 30 feet. It seemed the most ridiculous part of her entire plan. Heat rises, every child knew that. Her fire would never draw. The smoke would pour back into her room and choke her. It was a suicide machine born of ignorance. But Alara was not ignorant. She was following a principle her husband had explained to her from his books, the principle of thermal siphoning and the power of a long, heated flue. The massive brick stove was the engine. Once its great mass was hot, it would radiate a gentle, constant heat for hours, even days, after the fire itself had died down. The underground flue, warmed by the exiting gases, would create a steady, powerful draw that pulled smoke out and away, releasing it harmlessly and almost invisibly down the hillside. The earth itself would be her insulation, the brick her heat battery, and the clever flue her chimney. It was a complete system, each part dependent on the others. As the first snows began to fall, she finally laid a thick roof of sod over a timber frame, and her dugout disappeared, blending almost completely into the hill. From the settlement, it looked as if she and her son had simply vanished into the ground. They had a home with no visible chimney, a fire with no visible smoke. To her neighbors, it was the final confirmation of her folly. The storm did not arrive. It materialized. One afternoon, the pale sun vanished behind a screen of gray that thickened and lowered until the sky itself seemed to be pressing down on the earth. The wind, which had been a constant companion all season, stopped. A profound, unnatural silence fell over the plains. The settlers knew this quiet. It was the deep breath a predator takes before it strikes. Then, the first flakes began to fall. Not the gentle, drifting flakes of a pleasant snow, but small, hard pellets of ice that hissed as they hit the frozen ground. Within an hour, the world was gone, erased in a churning, blinding maelstrom of white. This was no ordinary blizzard. It was a land hurricane, a solid wall of wind and snow that moved with a terrifying force. The wind shrieked like a banshee, a physical blow that shook the log cabins to their foundations. Snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, driven with such power that it forced its way through the tiniest cracks in the walls, under doors, and even through the weave of cloth hung over the windows. The temperature plummeted. It dropped 10 degrees in the first hour, then another 10, then another, falling to a level of cold so profound that it felt like the very absence of life. Inside Marcus Thorne's cabin, the best-built structure in Providence Creek, the battle was being lost. He had a fire blazing in the hearth, a roaring inferno that consumed logs as thick as his thigh in under an hour. He and his eldest son were in a constant, desperate rotation, one feeding the fire while the other bundled up to face the storm for the next armload of wood from the pile just outside the door. But the heat was a fleeting ghost. The chimney, which he had built with such pride, was now his greatest enemy. It was a powerful vacuum, pulling the warm air from the room with a hungry roar, and with it, any hope of comfort. The cold was a physical invader. The drafts that sliced through the chinking were no longer mere annoyances. They were like daggers of ice. His wife and younger children were huddled on their bed, buried under every quilt and animal pelt they owned, their shivering a constant rhythmic tremor in the small space. The frost on the walls was no longer a delicate tracery. It was a thick, creeping armor of ice that grew thicker by the hour. Marcus could feel the life being leached from his home, from his family. He looked at the frantic, useless fire, and then at the pale, frightened faces of his children, and for the first time in his life, he felt a despair so total it was paralyzing. His knowledge, his experience, his strength, all of it was meaningless against this white fury. His way had failed. Meanwhile, in the hill, the storm was a distant rumor. Outside the thick sod roof and the earthen walls of Ilara's dugout, the wind howled its murderous song, but inside, an extraordinary peace reigned. The sound was muffled to a low, continuous moan, the fury of the world held at bay by tons of earth. There was no roaring fire, no frantic consumption of wood. Hours earlier, Ilara had burned a small but intense fire in the firebox of the great brick heater. The fire was now little more than a bed of glowing coals, yet the massive brick structure that dominated the center of the room radiated a profound and steady warmth. It was not the scorching, temporary heat of an open flame, but a gentle, pervasive heat that filled every corner of the space. The air was still and calm. There were no drafts. Thomas was sleeping soundly in his small bed, his breathing even and deep, his cheeks flushed with warmth, not fever. Ilara sat at her small table, reading one of her husband's books by the steady, clean light of an oil lamp. The temperature inside her home was comfortable, a consistent warmth that felt miraculous. She had used less than a dozen pieces of wood all day. Her revolutionary design, her supposed folly, was being put to the ultimate test. The earth was her shield, the brick was her hearth, and as the blizzard raged with a force that was tearing her neighbor's world apart, Ilara's dugout was an ark of calm, a small, stubborn pocket of civilization buried in the heart of the storm. It was working. The crisis in Marcus Thorne's cabin reached its breaking point on the second night of the storm. The woodpile, which he had thought would last a fortnight, was nearly gone. The temperature inside the room had dropped so low that the water in the bucket beside the hearth had a thick crust of ice on it. His youngest daughter's shivering had become violent, and her lips had a bluish tint that sent a spear of pure terror through his heart. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the air, that they would not survive another night. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Tradition was a lie that was killing his family. There was only one place to go, one desperate, humiliating chance. He made the decision in an instant. He turned to his wife, her face a mask of fear in the flickering firelight. "Stay here. Keep them covered. Don't let the fire die." He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped his face in wool until only his eyes were visible, and took up a coil of rope. He tied one end to the handle of his cabin door and the other around his waist. The blizzard was so thick he knew he could get lost 10 feet from his own home. He would have to feel his way, navigating by memory and desperation toward the hill where the foolish widow had buried herself. He opened the door, and the storm lunged at him like a wolf. The journey was a nightmare. The wind tore the breath from his lungs and blasted his exposed skin with ice. The snow was waist-deep, a thick, suffocating powder that fought his every step. He could see nothing, a total whiteout that erased the world. He moved by instinct, keeping the wind at his back as best he could, his frozen hands feeding out the rope, his only link to home. He stumbled and fell, the cold seeping into him, and for a moment he thought of just lying there, of letting the white silence take him. Then the image of his daughter's blue lips flashed in his mind, and he clawed his way back to his feet, pushing forward into the screaming void. He almost missed it. He blundered past the low mound, only realizing his mistake when he felt the ground slope away beneath his feet. He turned back, crawling on his hands and knees, sweeping the snow away until his glove met the hard edge of a wooden doorframe. It was real. He was there. He pounded on the thick planks with his frozen fist, a weak, frantic drumming. He waited, his hope draining away with his strength. He was about to collapse when he heard a bar being lifted from the inside. The door swung open. A wave of warm, still air washed over him, so profound and shocking that he nearly wept. It was not the dry, scorching heat of a fireplace, but a gentle, humid warmth that felt alive. He stumbled inside, and Alara shut the door, sealing out the storm. Marcus leaned against the wall, his body trembling, his eyes struggling to adjust to the dim, calm light of an oil lamp. He saw Thomas asleep in a corner bed, breathing peacefully. He saw a small, neat room, dry and orderly, and he saw the source of the heat, the monstrous brick stove in the center of the room. It was not glowing red, it was simply there, a dark, silent mass that radiated life. He looked around wildly for the roaring fire, for the smoke, for the chimney. There was nothing. The air was clear and breathable. He was warm. For the first time in 2 days, he was truly warm. Alara said nothing. She simply helped him out of his frozen coat and gestured toward a simple wooden chair near the brick mass. The warmth soaked into him, into his very bones. It was a feeling so foreign and so welcome that he could not speak. He, Marcus Thorne, the master builder, the man who had laughed at her, was now a refugee in her burrow, saved by her foolishness. He looked at her calm, quiet face, and saw not a fool, but a visionary. The stark contrast between this serene sanctuary and the freezing hell of his own cabin was a verdict. It was an undeniable, crushing judgment. He was wrong. Utterly, completely, and dangerously wrong. He finally found his voice, a raw, broken whisper. "My family," he rasped, the words tearing at his throat. "They're freezing. The wood is almost gone." He didn't need to say more. The desperation was etched on his face. Alara's response was not one of triumph or vindication. There was no "I told you so" in her eyes. There was only a quiet, resolute compassion. "Bring them here," she said simply. "Follow your rope back. I will have hot broth waiting when you return." Her quiet triumph was in her competence, in her simple offer of hospitality. She did not boast, she simply acted. She had built a vessel that could weather the storm, and now she was opening its doors to those who had been shipwrecked by their own certainty. Marcus looked at this small, determined woman and felt a wave of humility so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He had come seeking shelter, but he had found wisdom. Following his own rope back through the blizzard was just as harrowing, but this time Marcus was driven by a wild, desperate hope. He burst back into his own cabin, a specter of snow and ice, and the sight that greeted him solidified his resolve. The fire was a pathetic flicker of embers, and his wife was weeping silently, trying to chafe warmth back into their children's hands. "We're leaving," he commanded, his voice raw with authority and urgency. There was no time for questions. He bundled his children in every remaining blanket, creating small, cocooned shapes. He half-carried, half-dragged his wife and children back out into the storm, following the lifeline of the rope toward the impossible warmth of Alara's hill. Their arrival at the dugout was a scene of miraculous deliverance. As each child was passed through the door from the raging blizzard into the calm, steady warmth, the transformation was immediate. The violent shivering subsided, replaced by a deep, shuddering relief. Ilara was ready with blankets and hot broth, which she administered with a quiet efficiency that was both motherly and professional. Marcus watched, his heart aching with a mixture of gratitude and shame, as his family, who had been on the verge of freezing to death in his own expertly built home, were saved in the dirt-walled burrow of the woman he had mocked. Word did not spread. Desperation did. The storm did not relent, and by the third day, other families were reaching their breaking points. The next to arrive was the blacksmith, a barrel-chested man named Peter, who carried his ailing wife in his arms. He had seen Marcus's tracks leading away from his cabin and had followed them as a last resort. He arrived at Ilara's door, his face a mask of frost and fear, and begged for shelter. He, too, was welcomed in. The small dugout was becoming crowded, a subterranean ark filled with the refugees of a failed tradition. By nightfall, 3 families were huddled in the warm, secure space. The children slept together in a pile of blankets, their breathing peaceful for the first time in days. The adults sat in a quiet, stunned circle. The laughter that had once been directed at Ilara was gone, replaced by a profound, reverent silence. They looked at the simple, ingenious design of her home, at the massive brick heater that was the heart of their survival, and they understood. They had built their homes to fight the winter, to stand up against it. Ilara had built her home to cooperate with nature, to borrow the strength of the earth, and to hoard the treasure of heat. It was Marcus who finally broke the silence. He turned to Ilara, his voice stripped of all its former pride. "Teach me," he said. It was not a request, it was a plea. "Teach us all. We were fools." Ilara retrieved one of her husband's books. She opened it on the small table, the pages filled with elegant script and precise drawings of fireboxes and flue channels. In the steady glow of the lamp, surrounded by the humbled patriarchs of the community, she began to explain. She spoke of thermal mass, of how brick and stone could store heat like a sponge stores water. She explained the principle of the long, serpentine flue, showing them the diagram of how it forced the hot gases to give up their energy before they were allowed to escape. She explained why the underground chimney worked, how the long, gently sloping pipe created a powerful, steady draw that was more reliable than any vertical chimney, buffeted by wind. She shared her knowledge freely, without an ounce of condescension or resentment. Her reward was not their praise, but the sound of their children breathing safely in the warmth she had created. The student had become the master, and the chorus of doubt had become a classroom of eager pupils. When the great storm finally broke, after 4 days of relentless fury, the world that emerged was silent, white, and profoundly changed. The settlement of Providence Creek looked like a graveyard of failed ideas. Cabins were half buried in drifts that swept up to their roofs. Windows were shattered, and the precious woodpiles were all but gone. But the people were alive. They emerged from the warm sanctuary of Ilara's dugout, blinking in the bright, cold sunlight, looking upon their own homes with new eyes. They saw not shelter, but flaws. They saw foundations that were too shallow, walls that leaked heat like a sieve, and chimneys that were monuments to waste. That spring, a new sound filled the air around Providence Creek. It was not the familiar ring of axes notching logs for vertical walls. It was the rhythmic scrape and thud of shovels biting into the earth. Under Ilara's quiet guidance and Marcus Thorne's energetic direction, the entire community began to rebuild. They did not abandon their cabins, but they transformed them. They dug deep foundations, lining them with stone. They built massive brick heaters in the center of their homes, each one a careful copy of Alara's design. Marcus, once the most vocal skeptic, was now the most passionate convert, working tirelessly, checking every measurement, ensuring every flue was laid at the perfect angle. He became the translator of Alara's knowledge, turning her bookish diagrams into a practical craft that every man could understand and replicate. The landscape of the settlement began to change. The tall, proud plumes of smoke that had once defined each homestead were gone. Instead, on a cold morning, one could see small, almost invisible wisps of vapor rising from unassuming pipes low on the ground, far from the houses they served. The community was learning a new way to live, not in opposition to the harsh land, but in partnership with it. Their homes became more efficient, their winters less terrifying. They burned a fraction of the wood they once had, and their children no longer spent the cold months huddled and shivering. The story of the digging widow and her chimneyless house began to spread. Travelers and traders who passed through Providence Creek that next year were astonished by the transformation. They saw a community that was not just surviving, but thriving. They heard the story from Marcus himself, who told it not as a tale of his own foolishness, but as a lesson in the importance of listening, of setting aside pride to make way for a better idea. The tale traveled with them to other settlements, carried across the plains as a piece of practical gospel. The idea of the masonry heater, of thermal mass, and of the subterranean flue began to take root in other communities. A quiet revolution in survival, passed from one builder to another. Alara never sought credit or praise. She remained a quiet member of the community, respected and admired, but unchanged by her vindication. Her triumph was not in being right, but in the peaceful sleep of her son and the safety of her neighbors. She had faced a problem not with louder force, but with smarter thinking. She had listened to the wisdom hidden in old books and in the earth itself, while others had only listened to the echo of their own traditions. Years later, when new settlers would arrive, they would be baffled by the strange-looking homes of Providence Creek, with their low profiles and their lack of visible chimneys. They would listen, skeptical at first, as the old-timers told the story of the great storm of '73 and the widow who taught them all how to truly build a home. The story became a founding legend, a reminder that the most powerful solutions are not always the most obvious. It was a testament to the fact that true wisdom is often quiet, patient, and humble, working diligently beneath the surface, while pride and folly build noisy, hollow monuments to themselves in the open air, waiting for the inevitable storm to blow them down.